Hello, everyone, and welcome to Criminal Investigations, taught completely in an online format. Okay, so I know that for many of you, this is the first time you've taken an online class, and you're probably a little bit nervous, and I'm here to tell you, don't be so nervous, because you're going to be fine as long as you do what's expected of you, okay? There's nothing magical about taking an online class, especially not the way I run my class. I run this class like I would if we were sitting in a classroom. So, to begin with, I hope you have listened to the tutorial. Everyone should have received via email about a 15-minute audio tutorial on how we do things in this class. I would hope that you would have listened to it at least once, maybe twice. That would be ideal. Because that will give you a very, very good sense about how things are going to happen here. Okay? So, let me just get my textbook. You get your textbook. You should have your textbook open. You should have your notebook right next to you, ready to take notes, just as if you were sitting in a classroom, right, with me. And if you've taken me before in person, you know that that's the way I do things, right? We go through the text together, we talk about things, you take notes, and you'll be in good shape. So make sure you have your notebook out. I will always tell you the edition that I'm using for this particular lecture. For this particular lecture, I'm in the 11th edition of Criminal Investigation by Hess, Orthman, and Cho. So hopefully you have the 11th edition, and so you'll be able to follow along, no problem. Okay, so as we get into the text, the first thing I want you to look at on page 4, I want you to look at the can you define box, okay? The can you define box at the beginning of every chapter has a bunch of words and terms that you are responsible for. And the can you define box is also going to be your homework assignment for every chapter, right? And what does it mean? It means that you take the words or the terms and you look them up only in the textbook. I do not want you going on the internet or into other textbooks getting the definitions that come from those sources. I want the definitions that come from this particular textbook and put them into a Microsoft Word document, send them to me, put them in the homework Dropbox, and that's your homework for every chapter. All right, so without further ado, let's get in and let's go on to page 6, and we start off with a brief history of criminal investigation. Reading right from the text, it says, contemporary criminal investigation owes its genesis, make sure you know what genesis means, to several and notable individuals and events. The first significant one being the 1748 appointment of Henry Fielding as magistrate of England's Bow Street. In 1750, as a response to widespread crime and disorder throughout his jurisdiction, Fielding formed the Bow Street Runners, which became the first paid detective unit. Okay, so there's a little meat and potatoes in this little first paragraph here. What are the meat and potatoes in the paragraph? Well, the first thing is that Henry Fielding is a big deal in the study of policing, in the study of criminal investigations, and yes, even in the study of security, private security. The reason being is because Henry Fielding, who was a politician essentially and a law enforcement, like what we would consider sort of a judge, right? Henry Fielding created the Bow Street Runners, right? And he was credited with creating the Bow Street Runners, who really were historically kind of like the first men who were paid to combat crime. Now, you may think, well, a lot of people get paid to combat crime today. Yes, they do. But when Henry Fielding did it back in 1750, it was a big deal. It had not been done before, right? So let's go over to page 7. And the third paragraph down, it says, meanwhile, in the United States, make sure you recognize, of course, that Henry Fielding is overseas. He's in Great Britain. He's in England at the time, right? Okay, so it says, meanwhile, in the United States, the first municipal detective divisions were beginning to take shape. Alan Pinkerton, who immigrated from Scotland to the United States in 1842, played a significant historical role in modern police investigations. He was appointed the first detective in Chicago in 1849 and was co-founder of the Northwestern Police Agency, which later became the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, whose symbol was a watchful eye and whose motto was, "We never sleep." So let me stop right there for a second and talk a little bit about Alan Pinkerton. So Pinkerton was a Chicago police detective who figured out early on that the police couldn't do it all. So he started getting people to work for him as, quote, private eyes or private detectives, right? And the Pinkerton Agency grew to be one of the largest private security firms in the world, right? In fact, to this day, some old-timers in the security industry still refer to all private security guards. They say they're Pinkertons. They don't work for Pinkerton anymore because the company is gone. It's been bought out by somebody else and renamed. But the term Pinkerton has become synonymous with the private security industry. So continuing, it says, Pinkerton's agents were the forerunners for the U.S. Secret Service, and his agency was employed at the federal level for many famous cases, including protecting Abraham Lincoln in his presidency. Pinkerton developed several investigative techniques still used in law enforcement that include stings and undercover work, as well as the surveillance methods of shadowing and following targets or suspects. He was also known for working on a centralized database of criminal identification records that is now maintained by the FBI. Yeah, so Alan Pinkerton was a big deal, way ahead of his time, became famous, I'm sure became wealthy, and he's another big deal. You know, we started out with Henry Fielding, we go right to Alan Pinkerton. Two big names we're starting off with here. Okay, going down to the bottom of the page, the paragraph states, the use of biometrics and identification systems in criminal investigation began in 1882, when French police officer Alphonse Bertillon, now considered the father of personal identification, unveiled a system known as anthropometry, in which offenders, flipping the page, were identified by their unique physical measurements as well as personality characteristics and individual markings such as tattoos and scars. In 1884, Bertillon used his technique to identify 241 multiple offenders, demonstrating that the Bertillon system could successfully distinguish first-time offenders from recidivists. Well, first of all, make sure you know what a recidivist is, right? A recidivist is somebody who has committed any crime more than once, right? They've done a crime, then they go do another crime, they're a recidivist. Doesn't matter how many times they've been caught, that's another term, which we'll talk about. That's the recidivism rate. That's different. But the term recidivist means they're repeat offenders, right? So Alphonse Bertillon, another big deal, known as the father of personal identification, he's a cop in France, and he basically comes up with an idea. Like when they were bringing people in who were in trouble, people would give them any name, any address. And Bertillon started thinking about that. He started saying, well, why don't we record not only their names and their heights and their weights and their address, but why don't we record some physical characteristics, take measurements of some of their body parts, like the distance from the elbow down to the pinky finger, like the circumference of their head, the distance between their eyes, things like that. And so the Bertillon method was a way to start trying to identify people who might lie to the police about their identity, right? And then, of course, later on, when fingerprints and photographs come into play, Bertillon incorporates them into his Bertillon system, as it was known, or Bertillon, if you want to say it with a French accent, right? He was a big deal. It says, going right back to the text, it says, the system was quickly adopted by American and British police forces and remained a primary method of identifying suspects for more than 3 decades, when fingerprint analysis replaced it as a more accurate means of identification. I'm continuing in the text. It says, Bertillon also standardized the criminal mugshot, advocated that crime scene pictures be taken before the scene was disturbed in any way, we do that still today, and developed metric photography to reconstruct the dimensions of a particular space and the placement of objects in it. Other forensic techniques credited to Bertillon included forensic document examination, ballistics, the use of molding compounds to preserve footprints, and the use of the dynamometer to determine the degree of force used in breaking and entering. Remember that, Bertillon is a guy who sees that there's a lot of potential in the way you handle evidence and the way you process it and the way you assess it and analyze it. And he really, really gets going on that long before most people. But then a guy by the name of Edmund Locard steps up, right? And that's the next paragraph. Locard, another big deal, right? So you got Bertillon, Locard, Henry Fielding, Alan Pinkerton. These are all very important people in this discipline, in the historical context, right? So let's go down to the bottom of page 8. It says, the field of criminalistics and forensics began taking shape in 1910 when Edmund Locard, a French criminologist, set forth his exchange principle. By the way, we talk about Locard's principle of exchange all the time, stating that a criminal always removes something from a crime scene or leaves incriminating evidence behind. So let me stop for a second and talk about Locard's principle of exchange, right? Or Locard's exchange principle. It's the same thing, right? So Locard had this idea. He said that when bad guys come into well, actually, let me stop. He said really when all people come into a crime scene, including the bad guys, right? Because he really did mean everyone. When everyone comes into the crime scene, they bring things with them. Now, he didn't mean like they bring a bottle of soda. What did he mean? He meant we bring trace evidence in with us. The things that are on the bottom of our shoes come into the crime scene. Our hair, which we're constantly shedding, and our skin, which we're constantly shedding, wind up in the crime scene unless we take really, really good measures for it to not happen, right? And just not going off. But, when you see the crime scene techs in the spacesuits, that's why they're in the spacesuits, really, primarily, right? They're primarily in there so they don't get any infectious diseases and so they don't leave stuff in the crime scene that belongs to them, like their saliva, their hair, the stuff that's on the bottom of their shoes. You see them with the paper booties on and stuff like that, right? And by the way, hair, fiber, and all that, what do we call it? We call it trace evidence. I think I mentioned it already. Trace evidence. And then Locard said, yeah, when everybody comes in, they bring something, and when everybody leaves, they take something with them. And again, he didn't mean a bottle of soda. He meant when we leave a crime scene, we are taking some stuff with us on the bottom of our shoes or, flakes of skin or hair or fiber. And so his principle of exchange really means that every time a crime scene is processed, right, there is some level of contamination. There is. There is no perfection. You can't process a crime scene without contaminating it. Anthropologists have an old saying, you scar what you explore. And it means what it says. You scar what you explore. If you don't explore something, just leave it alone, it will be untouched. It will be pristine. But the moment you start delving into it and exploring it, you are essentially scarring it. It's the same thing with a crime scene. The question when it comes to crime scene processing always is, what level of contamination is acceptable, professionally acceptable, and what is excessive, right? And that's why crime scene technicians go through great pains to minimize the amount of disturbance that they bring to a crime scene, right? So let's go right back into the text. It says, under police leaders, I'm right at the bottom of page 8. It says, under police leaders such as August Vollmer and J. Edgar Hoover. Oh, I'm sorry. My mistake. Yeah. It says, under police leaders such as August Vollmer and J. Edgar Hoover, who is credited with molding the FBI into a credible national law enforcement entity, law enforcement and investigators in the United States began adopting Locard's exchange principle in 1932. And then there's a chat about August Vollmer, known as the father of modern policing. Take a look at that paragraph. That's a very good paragraph. And just getting back to Locard's principle of exchange for a moment. There's another theory that I want you to know, right? And the theory is Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty. Right? And let me spell it for you. Heisenberg. That's the name of the physicist who's responsible for its creation. Heisenberg, Heisenberg. So it's Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, Heisenberg. So what is Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty, and what does it have to do with crime scene investigations and Locard's principle of exchange? Well, listen to this. So Heisenberg was a physicist, and his principle of uncertainty, which is way over my head scientifically, okay, it basically said that if you have two molecules side by side, and they are identical, and you examine one of them and you leave the other untouched, they can never be identical again because you examined them, because you examined one of them. Do you follow me? So he said you have these two identical things side by side, and you examine one and you leave the other alone. He says your examination process will forever make that one not identical to the one that was untouched. And so you can see how there's a relationship there between Heisenberg, who was talking about atoms, and the Locard's principle of exchange, which basically says when you go into a crime scene, you bring stuff with you. When you leave, you take stuff with you, and you have to do your best to try and minimize that contamination, that spoilage, right? So I always teach Locard's principle of exchange and Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty in the same breath because I want students to know, right? Okay, let's go down to on page 8, definitions pertinent to a criminal investigation. And I'm reading right from the text. It says, an investigation is a patient, step-by-step inquiry or observation, a careful examination, a recording of evidence, or a legal inquiry. The word investigate is derived from the Latin word vestigare, meaning to track or trace, a derivation easily related to police investigations. Okay, then right underneath it, you see learning outcome 1. That's that blue shaded box. It says a criminal investigation is the process of discovering, collecting, preparing, identifying, and presenting evidence to determine what happened and who is responsible. Yeah, that's true. And I'll also give you my definition of a criminal investigation. And I have to say to you, it's really not mine. I heard an FBI agent use it a long time ago, and I basically stole it from him. I wrote it on a napkin, and because I thought it was so accurate and so on point. And so Cacciatore's version of or definition of a criminal investigation, or the mission of a good criminal investigation, is to uncover the truth and deliver the truth with integrity. That's my idea of a criminal investigation. That's my definition of a criminal investigation, to uncover the truth and deliver the truth with integrity. Right? All right, so let's go down to the paragraph below the blue shaded box. It says, criminal investigation is a reconstructive process that uses deductive reasoning, a logical process in which a conclusion follows from specific facts. All right, let's talk about deductive reasoning for a second, because I know that some students have a little difficulty with it. Okay, so what is that? So here's deductive reasoning at work. You're a cop on patrol, and you pull over a car. And when you get up to the car window, you notice a few things. One is the occupant smells like alcohol, strong scent of alcohol coming from him or her when they open the window. The next is you see their eyes are bloodshot. You see that their speech is somewhat slurred. And you suspect what? You suspect that this person might be driving under the influence, right? So you ask them to step out of the vehicle. They step out of the vehicle and they lose their balance. You come to the conclusion they are intoxicated and you place them under arrest. So you deduced, right? The term deductive reasoning, you deduced they were intoxicated. How? Well, your deduction, your inference that they're intoxicated is supported by facts. And what were the facts? Their eyes were red. They smelled like alcohol. Their speech was slurred. They were unsteady on their feet. So deductive reasoning is coming to a conclusion that is supported by facts. You don't know definitively if they're intoxicated at that moment, right? You don't. You surmise they are because the facts that are on hand support your conclusion. That's deductive reasoning, right? So let's go back into the text. It says, for example, it says finding the suspect's watch at the scene of a burglary is one piece of evidence that supports the premise that the suspect was at the scene. An issue that might arise is whether the watch could have been planted there. Investigators need to anticipate what issues might arise and what evidence is needed to support a prosecutor's case. All evidence in dispute must be supported by evidence. The more evidence an investigation yields, I should say, the stronger the proof of guilt. Equally important, however, is evidence that establishes innocence. So let's talk about this for a second. Two terms I want you to know: exculpatory evidence and inculpatory evidence. Exculpatory evidence, EXCULPATORY. That's EXCULPATORY. And then you have inculpatory evidence, INCULPATORY. INCULPATORY. What's the difference between inculpatory and exculpatory evidence? Okay. Exculpatory evidence is favorable to the defendant. It suggests that they are not the perpetrator. It suggests that they are not guilty. Exculpatory is favorable. Inculpatory is disfavorable to the defendant. It incriminates them. It suggests guilt. It infers guilt. Now, just so you know, a good way to remember the difference between inculpatory and exculpatory is inculpatory suggests the person inculpatory evidence suggests the person ought to be incarcerated, right? That's a good way to remember. Don't tell me inculpatory proves innocence. Inculpatory proves guilt, or exculpatory proves innocence. That's incorrect. But one is favorable to the defendant, the other is disfavorable. Exculpatory is favorable, inculpatory disfavorable, and incriminates them, right? All right, let's go over to the chart on page 9. Lots of good stuff on there. I want you to take a close look at it, and we're going to go over a couple of them right now. So what do we have? Well, it starts off with 1750, the Bow Street Runners, right, the first paid detective unit. Then they talk a little bit about Pinkerton. And DNA discovered 1868. This is an interesting one, because we discovered DNA in 1868, but it's not used in criminal cases until way over 100 years later because we don't understand DNA for the longest time, right? The human genome doesn't get unraveled for a long time before that. We begin to understand DNA over 100 years after it's discovered. But yes, it's discovered in 1868. 1882, they talk about Alphonse Bertillon. They talk about fingerprinting in 1896. I'm just going through this. I want you to look at this. Blood types in 1909, Edmund Locard in 1910, August Vollmer in 23, structure of DNA identified in the early 1950s, right? 1986, first use of DNA in a criminal case, which is in England, by the way. 1988, first use of DNA in a criminal case in the U.S., and once again, skipping down, 1994, Comstat, 1998, FBI launches CODIS. We'll talk more about that later. 1999, APHIS is launched, or IAPHIS, if you will. 2011, Next Generation ID is launched. And in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court rules that DNA can be taken from persons under arrest. No conviction is required. So now, essentially, the Supreme Court has ruled you can basically take DNA from a person who's under arrest very much the same way we take their fingerprints, right? You don't have to wait for any additional. You don't have to wait for the conviction, etc. You can take it, and in many states they have crimes that are listed for which you could take DNA at arrest, and in other crimes for which you can't, like low-level crimes. In some states, you're not allowed to take. The police are not allowed to take DNA, right? Like if you get arrested for like possession of marijuana, let's say, right? All right, so let's flip the page onto page 10. Okay, so looking at... okay, sorry about that. I got a little echo in there. Okay, so looking at the top of page 10, you see its definition of criminalistics, right? It says criminalistic refers to specialists. Criminalistics refers to specialists trained in recording, identifying, and interpreting the minutiae, that means minute details, of physical evidence. A criminalist, a.k.a. crime scene technician or investigator, searches for, collects, and preserves physical evidence in investigations of crime and suspected criminals. Criminalistics is a branch of forensic science, a broader field that encompasses the application of law that encompasses the application of scientific process to law, including legal inquiries conducted within the context of the criminal justice system. Thus, forensic science covers a wide array of disciplines, including pathology, entomology, odontology, anthropology, photography, serology, and toxicology. And then it goes on to say the first determination in a criminal investigation is whether a crime has in fact been committed. I can tell you that basically the first thing a cop does every single time they roll up on a job is they try to figure out, has a crime been committed? Because if a crime has not been committed, then chances are there's not much the police can do. And I'm talking about I'm not talking about someone who was hurt in a car accident or something like that. They're going to do what they have to do. But if I remember one time when I was a sergeant, someone was upset because their neighbor was not displaying the American flag properly, and I tried to explain very nicely to the gentleman that, we had no jurisdiction in that. And he got a little bit upset and, but I tried to explain to him that it wasn't something for the police to do. You know what I mean? Understanding whether or not, or being able to determine whether a crime has been committed, means that police officers have to understand what the definitions of crimes are, felonies, misdemeanors, criminal statutes, ordinances. They have to know things like the 4 culpable mental states. They have to know the terms mens rea and actus reus, and they have to know what strict liability offenses are. And, of course, the basic elements to virtually every major common crime. So I think I'm going to end part 1 here. There's a handout in the chapter for the 4 culpable mental states in the state of New York. It's the Chapter 1 handout. Make sure you have that handy for the Part 2 lecture, because it starts right out referencing that handout. Okay? So that's it for Part 1. Remember, you got to do the blog entries. They're worth 15% of your grade. Remember, you got to do the homework. They're worth 15% of your grade. Remember, you've got to take the exams within the time frame. When that chapter closes, that's it. All right. So make sure you get this stuff in. If you have any questions, you hit them, you create them on the blog. You post a new question on the blog, no problem. Make sure you're doing those required readings and doing those blog posts, though they're important. And so is the homework. Okay. You can get through this. You can do this. Okay, guys. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the blog.